Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Popular Music Books in Process series. As always, it's a joint project of IASPM US, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. It's great to see everybody on a day that music journalism can hold its head up with the conviction of R. Kelly, an event that's hard to imagine without the interventions of Jim DeRogatis and Dream Hampton over many years. So it feels good to mention that moment in our field today. I'm Carl Wilson, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbart and Kimberly Mack. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab. And you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric Weisbart's channel on YouTube, including last week's amazing discussion of Joshua Clover's new book on Jonathan Richman's Roadrunner with Eric and with Elizabeth Nelson. Next week, October 4th, we'll have Miles Marshall Lewis talking about his book on Kendrick Lamar and S.H. Fernando Jr. talking about the Wu-Tang Saga. But today, we're talking about software and music creation with Catherine Provenzano on her book in progress, Emotional Signals, Digital Tuning Softwares of the Work of Pop Music Voices, and Mike Derrico on his forthcoming book, Push, Software Design and the Cultural Politics of Music Production. Quick bios for each of them. Catherine Provenzano is an assistant professor of musicology and music industry at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music and is a performer and songwriter. Her research focuses on voice, instrumentality, labor, and technology as they intersect class, race, and gender in US popular culture. And Mike Derrico is director of music technology and composition, assistant professor of music and computer science, and music department chair at Albright College, where he teaches courses in music production, game design, songwriting, and popular music, and is published in a wide range of journals in those areas and edited related collections. He's also an electronic music producer and sound designer, for video games and for virtual reality applications. As always, during their conversation, please note your questions as you think of them in the chat sidebar. And in the last part of the session, Eric will use them to call on you for the Q&A. Of course, you can also use the chat for comments and conversation. The presenters will get a copy of the chat transcript after the session for their own reference. So that provides extra reason to keep active in there. And that's more than enough of me. So let's push start. And Catherine and Mike, please take it away.
Cool. So I'm gonna start us off here with a little presentation of the book that I'm working on, and then Mike will go, and then I think we'll be in conversation. I just want to start by saying how glad I am to be here. This series really was a bright spot last year, and I'm happy that it's kicked off again. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with Mike, kind of like continuing our thoughts of the last really decade. So to start off with this presentation of this book that really is in process, I'm really bringing the in process, I think, to the name of this series. I just want to give a little bit of a background on what pitch correction is, though many of you are probably familiar with this already. So I'll just start there, and then I'll present some of the kind of big issues that I confront in the book. So pitch correction is now a commonplace studio practice that uses digital software plugins to modify pitch, sometimes without artifact or without being able to hear it, or tell, You can think of it like a post-performance tuning mechanism for the voice and increasingly other instruments, so that's talked about a little bit less. And the tuning can also, I just want to note this, can happen in real time. Often there are these kinds of conversations that come up around authenticity and how we can still find it in the live performance. But I just want to note here at the beginning that Autotune Live also exists, and many people actually track to Autotune in their headphones in the studio. So the live functionality is sort of important there. The practice is most often ascribed to the software Autotune, which many of you probably know a lot about as popular music people. Autotune was patented in 1998 by the musician, inventor, and geophysicist, Dr. Andy Hildebrand. And in the patent of that product, just to give you a little teaser about how important emotion is to this whole thing, as is in the title of the book, Emotional Signals. So the patent says when voices or instruments are out of tune, the emotional qualities of a performance are lost. Correcting intonation, that is measuring the actual pitch of a note and changing the measured pitch to a standard, solves this problem and restores the performance, which is just such an interesting construction right at the start. so much to say about that, but there's limited time. So part of what I argue through the book is that while the introduction of Autotune was like a real moment of shift and change, and the tool really did open up all sorts of terrain and changed vocal practice dramatically in the studio, that the desires behind Autotune were already present in studio spaces. So engineers and vocalists and people who were kind of working with gear found all sorts of workarounds to try to pitch correct before this digital tool existed, and that its immediate success, like Autotune was a huge hit right from its premiere at NAMM. That initial success kind of indicates to us that there was already like a backlog of desire around what Autotune can do. Another clarification that I make in the book, or spend some time making, is that there's this kind of satisfying and sort of commonly reproduced history or story about Hildebrand as somehow stumbling upon Autotune through his work with Exxon or through his work in the oil industry. Some of you are probably familiar with that story, but I tried to demystify it and show that it's a pretty big misrepresentation of the origin of the tool, though, because Hildebrand did use a mathematical technique that he learned in graduate school that he used in the oil industry, but actually the algorithm of the invention is particular to the invention. It's not the same thing. So that's just sort of an aside, is like something I see come up in popular criticism a lot, is that like, it was magic that he was like finding undersea oil, and then all of a sudden he discovered Autotune, which didn't happen at all. Pitch correction encompasses the Autotune sound as we all know it. So if you think of Cher or T-Pain, lots of hip hop stuff, but it extends far, far beyond that too. It extends beyond the Autotune software itself. There are myriad plugins that are used for pitch correction, like WavesTune. Lots of the DAWs have a built-in kind of default pitch correction that you can use. But in the book, I analyze most closely Autotune and Melodyne, which are the kind of two top-selling softwares for this practice, and they're kind of thought of as competitors, and they debuted around the same time. Melodyne came out in 2000. I'm just going to put a little link in the chat here to a short piece that I wrote for Musicology Now about Melodyne, in case any of you want more info on that. So everyone, here we go. Just like a little introduction to some of the politics of Melodyne. Okay, and so I talk about these two tools in particular, yes, because Melodyne is Autotune's main competitor, and Melodyne came up so much in my research and in conversations and in the ethnographic work I was doing, but also because the tools really present a very fascinatingly different narrative of invention, and their origin stories are so disparate. So where Hildebrand, Autotune inventor, he was like, I want to make this specific software, and I wanted to do this specific thing. I want to make a box that can make anyone sing in tune, and had this vocal pitch correction idea in mind. Peter Neubaker, who made Melodyne, he set out to make an experimental composition tool, and throughout the evolution of his software, he really resisted its pitch correction capacities. So his team kind of overrode him at various points and said, well, this is actually the most this is how this software is going to be economically viable if we build in these various functions that'll make it easier to use as a pitch correction tool. And really the user community identified that Melodyne could be used as an effective pitch correction tool, even though the inventor didn't have that in mind at the start. So they're very different stories. And I spend like basically the first half of the book talking about that. And then that they also have really such different reputations. So Autotune became this kind of household name, and it also became really vilified. And Melodyne is thought of as this natural tool for real musicians, or like is like kind of the natural alternative to Autotune. And though that dynamic really trots out some really fascinating dynamics of race and gender. So I think it's like non-coincidental that the reputations of the two products are also associated with genres in different ways. So we have Autotune that is kind of thought of as this hip hop tool. And I've written elsewhere that it becomes a black sound throughout the 2010s. And then Melodyne is this more like art associated and tasteful way to pitch correct, and that it often corresponds with whiteness or not being marked at all. So that's, I spend some ink on that in the first half of the book. And let's see. Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about how I came into the project. It was almost an accident. In my first year of graduate school at the CUNY Grad Center back in 2011, I was writing a seminar paper that was basically a rhythmic analysis of the speech to song relationship in these videos that my friends were making, Autotune the News, which maybe some of you remember if you think back to like 2008, 2009, 2010. And so friends of mine were making those, and I was like writing, okay, how does the rhythm relate to like the spoken utterance and the way that that is songified? And then through that, I had an inkling that autotune and pitch correction was this sort of inexhaustibly interesting topic, which really has proven true for me over the last 10 years. I think I never get tired of it. So the project started then, really back in 2011. And after sort of sitting on it for a few years, I realized that the project would really benefit from an ethnographic lens. So starting in 2014, I started doing a pretty heavy ethnography of mostly sound engineers. So people who are kind of like in this middle space of the practice, and the people with their hands on the tools. So people making the decisions about how to pitch correct. And I was talking to artists too, and talking to lots of listeners, but really what I spent the most time on in the ethnographic work was talking to the people who were using the tools in studio spaces. And then in addition to that, I got to spend a good amount of time with the software manufacturers. So with the inventor of Autotune, the inventor of Melodyne, and their teams. And I got to sort of get a sense of how decisions are made in their office spaces, and like in the team, amongst the teams themselves, and how they test sounds, and the kinds of people that they use as beta testers, and the various versions that the programs go through before they get released to market, and the kinds of concerns that are built into that too. And part of like what was informing that decision to do ethnography was I was just perplexed at the start by who was interested in using the tools, because it was such a touchy topic at the time. It's hard to remember back to like 2010 and even 2014 when this was still a very controversial practice. I feel that that's changed now, but you would talk to a singer and the singer would say, no, I don't need it, or I don't want it. And you would talk to an engineer and the engineer would say, oh, this is like such soul crushing work, I hate doing it. I don't really want to work with singers who need it. And then, various people along the production chain, everyone hated it. So I was just trying to figure out, well, why is it happening if that's true? Or are people just sort of not reporting because this practice is kind of so controversial? Is it not being like reported correctly? So I just thought that the project would really needed that kind of grain to it. And those conversations are really the backbone of the book in many ways. So yeah, I mean, part of the advantage of following a contemporary project for so long, I was just sort of like mentioning this with Eric at the preamble of the call, is that I've gotten to see how attitudes around this practice have really changed over the last 10 years, 15 years. And not just that they've changed, but the discursive and practical mechanisms by which they've changed. So there are stand-ins that there are ways that the logic of the voice is kind of reconstituted in a pitch correction paradigm that I think are incredibly interesting, and a lot of them hinge on this concept of emotion. So yeah, I mean, the shift I think really did happen in 2014 when T-Pain did the Tiny Desk concert. I think that was a just incredibly important moment of a sort of like bourgeois performance of realness in this space, where now all of a sudden people who had skepticism about what Autotune was or what it could do could feel more comfortable like knowing that a real artist is behind it, because we've seen T-Pain reveal his real voice. And so that logic, and it's still like, I have an Autotune Google alert, and like the Tiny Desk concert comes up all the time. Like my doctor mentioned the Tiny Desk concert the other day. Like he knows that this is his entry into, being comfortable with this technology. So like part of the big argument of the book is that the controversies around tuning's ethical and moral status really ended once users, performers in the press, and listeners formed a conceptual frame in which pitch correction recuperated emotionality. and in which the sound of modified pitch became co-present with or even indexical of emotion and not its antagonist. So over the 20 years or so since the softwares have really become sedimented as studio convention, there's been this central preoccupation about how pitch correction, like whether its practice produces voices that are real or not, and in which ways they are real. And this is really not a concern that's isolated to technophobes or authenticity seekers. It's a concern that extends to creators who even wholeheartedly embrace new vocal production techniques, including pitch correction. These artists, and for these enthusiasts of the technology, the construction of realness really, it doesn't go away. It simply hinges on different values, which I try to show. And at either pole, really, when we listen for realness, we miss the complex labor relationships behind how the softwares are made, how they're used, who buys them, who vocalizes with and against them. So emotional signals is an examination of those relations with special attention given to the dynamics of power and labor that qualify them. And there I've really benefited, I think, from looking at this middle person, like the engineer, people in the engineering role who are doing a lot of the actual work of pitch correction. And I think this will kind of be one of the ways that I really connect with Mike's work. I'm also looking at how the softwares are documents, they're actual artifacts of vocal value through what can be read in their design and their interfaces. One of the main interventions I'd like to make is to just show how important this concept of emotion is to design, that this vague concept, and I admit it's vague, that's why there'll be many pages devoted to it in the book of like what it is and what it does. But that concept nonetheless is written into the functions and designs of the programs, both Autotune and Melodyne. And beyond this, there are hearings of the Autotune voice as an emotional voice, which we all know if we think to, like, for example, 808s and Heartbreak is this really important moment where people all of a sudden start hearing Autotune as an emotional sound, but it's not exclusively emotional across identity. It's really almost exclusively granted to male artists and not female artists. So the Autotune effect works as an emotional, like chrysalis, even emotional swaddle for certain male artists, but you don't actually read about it or hear about it talked about so much as something that does the same thing for female artists. So I try to trot out why that's true. And yeah, the book kind of an approach, and instead of adopting this as sort of more strict user as agent framework or a framework that would emphasize the power or the kind of like magical qualities of the software, I'm looking at this in-between space, the operations and studio space and discursive practice, the labor negotiations that go into making voices in a pitch correction paradigm. And this work, as you probably guessed by now, it so often hinges on taken for granted concepts like that are like shorthand for what the voice is supposed to do, including emotional or what makes a voice emotional, depending on who or what is doing the labor. So that the concept of emotion actually really is like a gateway into thinking about questions of identity, since emotion doesn't work equally across identity at all. And that's, I think, where the ethnography has helped me a lot too. So yeah, I think that's about all I want to say. I suppose I can just like end by saying that the argument of the book is that it's actually hearable in the pop music voices of the last quarter century, that how much identity informs expectation of how one signals or sounds emotion, and that vocality is this emotional practice that is evolving alongside the practice of pitch correction, which opens up a kind of emotional terrain of studio practice and of singing itself. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Mike, but I'm very excited for the combo to follow.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I came up with a bunch more questions just as you were talking, so I'm looking forward to talking with you more about the project in our kind of collab session. Thanks everyone. Thanks to the organizers for having me and Catherine here today. Thanks to Catherine for putting this all together. I think she mentioned, we've met for the past decade or so. We've met at conferences. I remember when she was doing research out in Los Angeles and out west, we met at UCLA to talk about this stuff. And so I think both of these projects are such a long time coming. So thanks for kind of setting this up. And shout out to my editor, Norm Hershey, who's here today. Just in case you didn't see the chat, Kim put out the discount code. So if you pre-order the book, which should be out, I think, late December, early January. But if you pre-order it, there is a discount code in the chat, which I think is definitely a reference to the Far East movement, like a G6, if you check that out. So if you input that at checkout through the OUP website specifically, then you can get a discount on pre-orders. So I figured I'd talk through like the genesis of the project as a way to get into kind of each chapter as a case study. The title of the book is Push Software Design and the Cultural Politics of Music Production. And it really didn't start out as such. So it's really a long time coming, and I'm just finishing the copy edits now. So I'm kind of like finally reaching the end, I guess, at this point. But it really started back in 2011 when I moved out to Los Angeles. I was initially thinking of doing a sort of straight up ethnography on the Los Angeles beat scene. I was really interested in people like Flying Lotus, Daedalus, Jay Dilla, that whole scene that really congregated in one club, which was the Low End Theory Club, which has since shut down. It shut down in 2018. But I initially went out there to kind of study that scene and think about experimental hip hop and how these artists use technology to kind of rethink traditions in hip hop and all that. I started doing straight up kind of ethnography, talking to people like Fly Low and Anderson .Paak. This was like, he got his start out at Low End Theory. Talking to these people like out on the Low End Theory patio in Lincoln Heights. And but after a while, I realized I wasn't really, a lot of them were just kind of, promoting their stuff. And it wasn't really getting at the types of questions that I was really interested in about how they intersected with technology. And that kind of got me kind of more interested in thinking about like their use of technology outside of the specific box of music, because I noticed a lot of them were using technology, using different software and new hardware platforms to kind of work not only in hip hop and electronic dance music, but a lot of them were doing video game work, like virtual reality sound design type stuff, especially people like Daedalus were very involved with that. And if you follow Flying Lotus's work, he's very involved with movies and kind of video games and all that. So that took me to a sort of a straight ethnography for the musicians themselves, and then starting to actually talk with the companies behind a lot of the technology that they were using. In order to do that, I really had to kind of take on a new role. I kind of stopped being a strict kind of musicologist and use my connections in other areas, like in my teaching. For example, I was teaching in the UCLA music industry program, and I was teaching like practical music production skills like audio engineering, MIDI sequencing, and all that. And I made a connection with Ableton, the company that makes that live software, for example, through their brand managers, because I was reaching out to them to think about how we could get the software available to students and all this type of stuff. At the same time, I was pursuing with Avid, the company that makes Pro Tools, kind of certification processes so that I could certify students in the Pro Tools software. So I kind of followed this very alternative path to doing ethnographic research, to kind of become an industry insider in that way, rather than just being like, hey, I'm a musicologist and I have these really deep questions I want to talk to you about. Even there, though, I was finding that like the ethnographic approach just wasn't really necessarily working for what I wanted it to do. I think the questions I started to think about were these kind of age-old media theory questions, like, going back to Marshall McLuhan or Friedrich Kittler, like the idea, or Langdon Winard's question of, do artifacts have politics? And I got really interested in that question. How could music software function in sort of like going against the musicological trends? How could music software be like a technologically determinist thing that really does shape how we use it and how we think about music, capital M type stuff? So I really started to think that to answer that question, I kind of had to look at the design of the software itself. So I was kind of building off a few key like disciplinary trends at the time, including interface studies, which was sort of a branch of media theory, which was a sub branch of software studies. And so coming from like Wendy Chun's idea of software as ideology, she had this idea that software is sort of an analog to ideology, because the very nature of what it's supposed to do is use a flashy user interface to hide how it works, right? So this became a fundamental principle of software studies for media theorists. So you had people like Wendy Chun or Ian Bogost or Nick Montfort, who were literally writing books about like a single line of software code and analyzing that single line of software code to understand an entire culture of practice. And I thought that's a really interesting type of analysis to do it. It reminded me of hermeneutic analysis from musicology, kind of close reading and thick description from ethnomusicology. So that's where the genesis of the project became, like looking at individual case studies on musical software and the interfaces within them to think through how can we read the design of that software to understand the cultural communities that are a part of their creation. So each chapter is very much a case study in a software, and then relating that software to a community of practice to think about how communities of practice and in conjunction with the software design has shaped our understandings of music and its ontologies of various sorts. So I'll try to kind of like skim through each chapter. At this point, you can access the companion website, which I think could be useful to anybody that's interested at this point, because the companion website has a lot of videos that demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about in each chapter. So there was a lot of green screening and a lot of doing what we all do nowadays as teacher, working with screen shares and stuff like that. Each chapter has a lot of videos that kind of outline the main points I'm getting at. So even before the book comes out, that might be a useful thing to check out. But I kind of start with one of the more popular DAWs, or digital audio workstations for music producers nowadays, which is FL Studio, or what used to be known as Fruity Loops. And this software got really popular in the hip hop world, where if you remember back to like Soulja Boy and Crank That, he was like one of these first producers who cracked FL Studio. It became like one of these softwares that was very easy to crack. So it was very easy to access for producers. And he says, like, I made Crank That in like 5 minutes using the cracked version of the software and like the basic presets of the software. And so it became known as the software that was used for its kind of speed, efficiency, and optimal workflow, and kind of one button presets to just make something sound like a banger, right? And that's very much still the kind of perception of that software. A lot of my students use this, and it's very much like, record the track in 10 minutes, slap the sound goodizer preset on there, and then you're good to go. And so the whole point of the chapter is called Plug-in Cultures, is to connect how the values embedded in that software design and how the producers that use it embody these values of like neoliberal capitalism, this sort of speed and kind of productivity of neoliberal capitalism, really building off Robin James' work in the sonic episteme. She does hint at a lot of like how these softwares work, but I would look at my work as kind of like a deeper dive into the sort of technical details of how the software works to do these things. I specifically relate it to hip hop and electronic dance music, another connection there, which is actually going to be part of the forthcoming JPMS issue in December, right? If I can announce this, I guess, right? It's a digital lecture that I create about the connection between FL Studio and electronic dance music, and how we can think about like this toxic masculinity in EDM culture as related to like the design, the sort of maximalist design of this software. I talk a lot about, like, from the perspective of the developers of the software, I talk about things like feature creep and the connection between the music products industry and the desire for just more and more features and maximalist workflow and productivity and that type of thing. FL Studio becomes the sort of apex for that. The second chapter kind of looks at a related software, but really looks specifically at this question of remediation. So the second chapter, I look at Ableton Live software and look at that question of skeuomorphic design. That is design that takes the elements and the design trends of previous tools and applies them to software. So the chapter really looks at three softwares. It looks at Pro Tools, which is kind of seen as the quote unquote industry standard software, Logic Pro X, both of whom really use skeuomorphic design in a lot of their software. They use, like, buttons and knobs and faders from analog mixing boards and things like that. And then I talk about how a software like Ableton really markets itself as being a little different than that. and the way in which like how the cultural communities surrounding each software change. And I bring up the question of how, especially post like Me Too and these movements for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the music products industry, I try to look at how, if Ableton succeeds in kind of using their design model and their marketing model to introduce more kind of equitable practices in the industry. So I bring up this concept of monopolies of competence, which I apply to Pro Tools, because I look at how the design of that software really models the attitudes that its users have toward it, which is a lot of, for those of you who may know this world, a lot of people kind of who use Pro Tools or who have like vouched for Pro Tools for the past 40 years as an industry standard, would look at this software as the sort of like, you know, gold standard, and that it's really made for professionals, and that it's difficult to use because that's what makes it professional, right? So it's sort of like the struggles that people face with it become sort of a rite of passage as opposed to just being bad software design. And a lot of that research that I conducted on that software was specifically through my experience kind of training to become an Avid certified instructor, and asking them about these, what I saw as these kind of like design flaws. Like, why is it that you really kind of need 2 windows to work on the software? Or why is it that like you, after 30 years of design, you don't have a musical typing keyboard? So you really need like a MIDI keyboard to use this to really sequence with the software. They just introduced that musical typing feature like last year. So I look at a lot of these kind of design considerations as a sort of part and parcel of the way users use that software as a sign of their own competence as audio engineers, and how Ableton kind of might offer a glimmer of hope kind of away from that model. Chapter 3 kind of gets into like, you know, going from this maximalist design model and this feature creep model of like offering the user as many tools and features as possible to kind of what do you do when you're presented with a blank screen. And that's where I look at MaxMSP, or currently now Max, the software that was designed by Miller Puckett at Earcom back in the 80s. And this is a very different model, very different communities of practice than a lot of the previous DAWs, more used by sort of experimental music communities. But the unique thing about this software is that historically it's been just sort of like a blank screen with which you can patch your own instruments. And that comes from this very staunch stance by the developer, Miller Puckett, and others, and those that use the software, that like, you know, you don't, if you really want to build something that's useful for you as a creator, you can just patch it yourself. You don't need the big fancy DAWs and all that. So I kind of connect software like that with a whole different lineage of communities. I kind of look at the history of the Californian ideology and software and computing, and that's kind of the Silicon Valley mentality about software. So I kind of look at this longer history of like the Californian ideology, which connects kind of neoliberal values with this kind of the 60s counterculture. This is really the world that people like Steve Jobs kind of came from, right? And so I'm looking at a software like Max as a product of that kind of lineage. And in doing so, I kind of connect it to sort of values of like whiteness within computer science departments across the country, and how a lot of the community surrounding Max, as well as kind of communities surrounding computer science departments and things like that, are so staunchly kind of white male oriented. And thinking through how we might think through a more maybe relational kind of human-centered design for software that I do believe Max kind of has the potential to usher in, but I don't think it does it right now in the types of communities that are surrounding it. All right, I'm going to kind of go real quick through the remaining chapters, but chapter 4 looks at controllerism, like what happens when software becomes hardware. You know, if we think of software as initially designed based on existing hardware from the skeuomorphic model, what do we do now? How do you design hardware interfaces that are used to kind of interact with software? And that gets at the question in DJ culture: how do you perform live in the perceived kind of death of the vinyl record, right? So if DJs were so used to kind of spinning vinyl in live context, as they gradually transition to software-based tools like Serato or Tractor, and the interfaces for controlling these tools get smaller and smaller, from a vinyl record to like plastic USB kind of discs to iPad apps and things like that. How do artists negotiate that transition? And so I kind of connect controllerism in the world of electronic dance music and DJing to video game controller design. So I look at kind of successful game controller design. Like if you think about video game controllers, like a PlayStation or an Xbox controller, what they do well is that they abstract complex series of gestures to small, to a small series of shapes and letters, right? So you press the X button or you press a trigger on a game controller, it could do any number of things, from swinging a sword to like triggering, you know, a cutscene or something like that. And I kind of apply game theory surrounding those controllers to the design of tools like the Ableton Push MIDI controller or the Native Instruments Machine controller. And so that's kind of a venture into the world of ludomusicology, right? That connection between music studies and game studies. Continuing in that vein of when software becomes hardware, I have a chapter on apps, music software design for mobile apps, and I kind of tackle that age-old question of quote unquote democratization. And like, you know, are these apps like just another example of how users have become tethered to this neoliberal world of like Apple design, you know, where we use these products and we become just more and more tethered to the Apple model of marketing, where every 2 years we have to upgrade our hardware. And so I think about this as this sort of upgrade culture. Jonathan Zittrain calls these things like tethered appliances, right? So is that the nature of sort of app design? Is that all it is? Like when we use apps, are we just tethering ourselves to immaterial labor and things like that? Or is there something to be said for like the way that you know, like Steve Lacy produced like entire tracks from Kendrick Lamar's Damn album on an iPhone, right? So is there some sort of way in which these could function as like what Wahalia calls like desiring machines in pop music, where they could be sort of a liberating tool for breaking down barriers and accessibility, right? Chapter 6, I go into kind of more straight video game theory, kind of crossing media, to talk about Unity 3D software, which is a game engine for designing sound. I kind of connect that software to the indie gaming aesthetic to think about how this tool kind of works as what some have called like an emergent interface, where sound in the context of video games nowadays really does become spatial. And of course, this is something that's on our minds as music scholars because of the rollout of like spatial audio in Apple Music. But I kind of look at that in the context of software itself. What happens when we can think about sonic assets as a 3D, as a spatial thing? And I kind of connect that to the culture surrounding indie games, which is really a response to kind of this fast-paced AAA kind of first-person shooter world, where it's all about kind of speed and linear narrative and all these types of things, where we're working in these 3D sandbox spaces, like something like Minecraft or something like that, could be a much more a way to kind of encourage users to kind of be comfortable with not doing anything, and that there doesn't have to be a sort of goal behind the experience. Chapter 7, the most recent chapter, is about, and this is maybe the most recent connection to Catherine's work, which is about automated mixing tools. So it's the use of artificial intelligence in mixing tools like Isotope's Ozone and Neutron and Nectar. And for those that don't know, Isotope is a company out of Cambridge, Mass. that specializes in like artificial intelligence and machine learning applied to presets for mixing your music. So you can have the software listen to your whole mix, and based on an algorithm of thousands and thousands of deep learning of popular music tunes, it'll say, we think that you really need more bass here. We think that you need more highs in the vocals. We think that you need more compression here and there. And it kind of gives you a one-button preset that they call the like mixing assistant. So I look at this software in this long line of sort of automated assistants for music production, going back to things like the Rhythmate and these organ assistants, right? Where you could have like the drum machines connected to the organ as a supplement to your playing, right? There's like one story I tell where, you know, in the early days of those sort of automated drum machine assistants, clubs, the musicians union actually required that if you used one of these automated these automated drum machines in a live context, you actually had to pay the musician the cost of 3 musicians, because it was like you were basically stealing labor, right? So I get into that question of how this could, like, does this, threaten the labor of mixing engineers and mastering engineers who spend years and years developing what they call big ears and these critical listening capacities? What role does the sort of human ear have in the perception of popular music nowadays, in the context of these automated assistants, right? And then finally, the conclusion, I think about I basically think about where we just came from, which is the pandemic, and the sort of world that music software presented to a lot of performers and teachers and musicians. So I think about music software in the context of COVID, and what is the future of sort of interface in this context. A lot of the world that we sort of ended up there was like the virtual model as or virtual choir as the model for like performing, right? How many times do we see scrolling through the social media feeds, there's a sort of square grid of everybody performing together, and how this really does connect back to Chun's idea of software as ideology, because this is about like the perception that we're seeing people perform live and that we really are all in this together, when in reality this is like the apex of the most post-produced product that we could have, right? Is that you have to like stitch these videos together in Adobe Premiere or something, and edit the video to make it seem like we're all in it together, and to think about what that has to say about the future of all these tools. I think I'll cut it there just because I think gone a few minutes over anyway, but I'm happy to answer any sort of deeper questions about any of those case studies.
So now, did the two of you want to talk, just the two of you together for a bit before we open it up to audience questions? Was that the plan? Okay, great.
Yeah, Mike, I think there's so much to unravel here, and now I have a bunch of notes, but I think if you're up for it, I would love to kind of start on this question of masculinity in design. And it's great to hear you talk about this like maximalist design approach. And for me, is such a different question, because when I'm thinking about the way that masculinity plays out in relation to Autotune, it's so often is like this. Autotune is referenced anyway by the people that I speak with as something that protects the emotional ability of the singer in the studio, or sort of like it helps kind of draw out the emotional voice, or it's something that amplifies the emotional voice in certain ways, which is really like an unexpected turn. Like, I don't think either inventor would have thought that like there would be this huge way that masculinity plays into the use of the product, though. I mean, I guess with like a lot of the software design, that's always there. But I'm wondering if you're just like willing to elaborate on this question, like who you see using the tools and the way that masculinity plays out in some of that work.
Yeah, I talk about it a lot with the FL Studio chapter, really building off Ryan Diddick's book, Mad Skills, which if anybody's read that, it's a great book about kind of the history of MIDI, and kind of the branching of MIDI away from player pianos and coming from all that type of stuff. The story he really tells there, though, is about how a lot of these tools have to become basically like defeminized in a lot of ways. Like if a player piano was initially this like domestic tool, where it was like this was a tool that women in the home could use in that space, in order to turn it into like a quote unquote professional thing, they had to kind of like make it be seen as not a domestic thing anymore, and as like more of a serious type tool, right? And FL Studio charts that same trajectory because it was initially called Fruity Loops, and the developer of the software specifically calls out the connotations to homosexuality as like a reason why they changed the name. He said it was initially called Fruity Loops, but we had to change the name just because of its connections to like, or he said something like because of its obvious connections or something, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the people using that tool really have had to kind of like get away from the tool as like this one button preset thing to being like this serious tool that they can kind of like pride themselves on, like the amount of money they've made off of it and stuff like that. I think to summarize a more like a more kind of clear concept about that, there's a concept called scientific masculinity. It's, I think, Robert Nye is the Erica Milliam and Robert Nye, they come up with this idea of scientific masculinity, which is about scientists really using rationality and objectivity as signifiers of masculinity, right? I make the obvious connection. There was a Hard Times article about Ben Shapiro, and it said like Ben Shapiro produces new album using only Logic Pro and Reason. You know, the fact that all these DAWs are named after like this like signifiers of rationality and things like that. And he was saying that like tools like Ableton Live just aren't reasonable enough or something, and it's very easy to fall into like the hysterics of femininity or something with these other tools, and Logic Pro was the only pro solution. So that's a concept that I think comes up. I think about that in terms of Autotune. I don't know, because it is kind of flipped in your situation, you know, which you've already obviously brought up in relation to T-Pain.
Yeah, but sort of. I mean, it's interesting that like the Autotune voice, as when it's technologically announced, so when you can hear the Autotune effect, that Autotune becomes this kind of like signifier of masculinity. And then I'm thinking like in the rest of the book about the politics of singing labor, and how, you know, singing is obviously so feminized and has been thought of as like feminine labor in various contexts, and R&B and in other genres. So there's this way that like the singing voice that is also this kind of technologically embodied voice is once again then rendered masculine. So like there's a way to do the singing, but also to do this kind of tech work at the same time. You can hear both. So you're protected from the feminization of singing. And I think if you like listen to hip hop of the last 10 years or so, you hear so many fewer female sung hooks, like even like soul hooks aren't there as much anymore. And instead you hear male performers doing this singing labor that is like facilitated by the tool. Whereas, you know, you don't hear almost any female rap. I mean, this is just changing, like I would say even in the last year, but the female rappers who are huge right now, none of them are using the Autotune effect. It's just not, it's not there. So like why, you know, there's this huge lag between like between voices that are kind of like given permission to occupy that technological sound. And again, it is changing now, but it took a long time. And that's again the advantage of looking at a tool over the course of many years, because you get to see that. It's not like it just happens overnight. But yeah, I think like with like the professionalization of the tools, the audio engineering space is so male. And I'm seeing this question that Kira is saying, like, yeah, what's the experience of female engineers? And it is different. I've been lucky to talk to, you know, several female engineers in the spaces, and like their approach to the tools is even different, and thinking about like what Autotune can do and what it's useful for in the studio. But for the most part, it's like studios are super male, and like there's the subjectivity that's happening on the side of like both the software design and then like all of these decisions in studio practice with people with their hands on the tools. It's like almost it's a masculine subjectivity straight down the line. So, you know, I'm like thinking about what happens to vocality along that chain. I think it's pretty profound. I don't know, that's not exactly what you were talking about, but I suppose it's one way that our Venn diagrams overlap.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I was thinking just as you were talking too, the way my male students will use Autotune to like engineer sessions. It's often like when they apply Autotune to their own voices, it's seen as like, how can they virtuosically like manipulate Melodyne in such a way, and to sort of take control of that software in such a way that they can make their voice bend in various ways, right? But when they use it on female performers, it's always talked about as like, oh, we're just using it to fix her voice.
Yep.
So a totally different understanding of why you're using the software, which
right.
isn't entirely gendered.
Yeah, totally. And I think like that, well, part of what I wrote about in the attached article, I think to the email for this event, is this concept of non-consensual tuning, which, you know, when I started the project, artists would say like, oh, no, I don't need Autotune, and I don't ask for it. And I actually say to my engineer, don't do it. But engineers were doing it anyways, and mostly on female singers. And, you know, up until now, where there's like, I think artists feel a bit more agency, and they also feel less like tender about whether or not they need it, because everybody needs it. And now it's sort of like known that there's no song that comes out in the pop world that isn't using Autotune. It just doesn't happen anymore. So those conversations can happen. But before that, engineers, you know, that I like have interviewed and have been talking to, they would just make the executive decision to tune it anyway. And, yeah, so there's this question of agency and like, and the parts of musical labor that are considered valuable that have to do with tools in so many ways, not just like the DAWs and then all the plugins too. Yeah.
This came up, Catherine, if you're okay with me addressing one of Kira's.
Yeah, please.
She brought up the hearing about women in the spaces of engineering, music, and music tech.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in that sort of Ableton chapter I have, towards the end, I address the sort of emergence of these sort of female-centered initiatives like Beats by Girls, which is founded by Erin Barra, the director of pop music studies at ASU, and how these groups have to basically play on the sort of masculine model of engineering that has been built. And like you were mentioning, Catherine, in terms of rappers, like female rappers nowadays are still in this mold of like feeling like that in order to legitimize themselves, they have to take on that sort of early 90s male rap style in order to sort of like be seen as legitimate. And I feel like that's happening in the music tech world now too, whereas a lot of what Beats by Girls has to do is really like play up the expertise and the sort of like technological control of the previous generation of audio engineers, because that's still seen as like, how you pay your dues in that world or something. But I think her work, for people that are more interested in stuff too, definitely follow up with Erin Barra's women in music tech research that she's doing right now. This is like a large scale initiative, a research initiative that she's conducting to really look at like the numbers and look at like the actual trends in the music products industry, to look at like exclusionary gender dynamics and things like that.
Yeah, that stuff is so big. I mean, I think like the recreation of various models for like a new female, I mean, not new, it's not like it's not like female engineers haven't been doing work for so long, or like female rappers haven't been rapping for so long. It's just that they get, more easily ignored or forgotten. And then, the models in which they maybe get recognition so often follow the kind of like patriarchal models that have come before. And that's it's not necessarily that like various kinds of work aren't happening. It's just which kinds of work are like recognized, lauded, et cetera, valued. And that kind of tends to follow a predictable template. It's the template that we have, and that hasn't really shifted very much. Maybe we should open it up, since we have, what about?
Yeah, I'm happy to bring in folks for Q&A. Didn't want to cut anything off, but just backtracking a little bit, and let's start with the first question from Gus Stadler.
Hi, I really enjoyed both of those talks. Thanks so much to both of you. I think, so the question is for Mike, and I guess I kind of just wanted to ask, like, is there anything interesting to say about GarageBand in this framework? I guess kind of my sense would be that it's sort of like, as I said, the abject other to all of, considered by professionals to be the kind of like abject other to all of these more sophisticated DAWs, and that could be obviously also gendered, but also is just thinking about how it's just such to me an interesting phenomenon, how ubiquitous it is, comes free with any Mac, and then like kind of what it does to amateurism, and like, because when you used to have to use a 4-track, like you clearly had some relationship to like amateurism, or like, I guess lo-fi also, but like this is so designed to make it kind of like look like, or give a sheen of professionalism, or at least to maybe make you think that while you're using it. I don't know, but anyway, I was just curious what your thoughts about its sort of cultural meanings are, and whether those have changed over the years at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do address GarageBand and the whole kind of Apple, like what used to be called like the iLife suite, or like, as Apple, or sorry, GarageBand, Pages, like the whole suite of Apple's creativity tools, right? Which I think all do very similar things. So chapter 6, which is where I kind of get into like apps, and I look at the history of like personal computing. So I get into a lot of like Apple's marketing ethos. which really came down to like this idea that it was like the way they marketed Pages, for example, was like writing has never been easier, period. You know, like if you use this software, you could write that book you've always been looking to. And that's the same, you know, with GarageBand. They marketed as like this, like kind of the ethos of a lot of apps is designed for music making, which is like easy music. It's just like if you want to make something real quick, obviously that's coming from FL Studio in a lot of ways, but I think apps and this sort of and GarageBand have embraced the non-professional status of it, and I think that's why they've done well. I think GarageBand is one of the best designed softwares out there, because it doesn't sort of make any claims to try to. It really is starting. It really has moved away from the sort of skeuomorphic model, which I associate with like quote unquote professionalism, and that's allowed it to kind of appeal to a much wider base. I think especially, you know, for children to use, I think this is like it's a great tool. So I do think that it actually is a really powerful tool for actual, I guess, you know, to use the term like democratization or whatever, but I think for amateurism, I think, you know, it has clear implications for just this tool that is outside of the sort of commercial mold in some ways. Obviously, it's tethered to one of the biggest companies in the world, but like it does have sort of like, to me, actually like a radical potential in its design that a lot of other software doesn't embrace.
Thank you. How about Brian Wright?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Both of these were really interesting. Your discussion kind of nuanced the question in my mind as I was going, so I'm going to kind of throw that out and try a different one here, which is, you know, you brought up this idea of technological control and legitimacy, but most of it seemed to me you were talking about from a user-centric perspective, where it's the legitimacy of the discourse of the masculine users who use it, right? And I wanted to ask about that more from the perspective of the software companies who, you know, sanction particular uses, value particular uses, want to have some sort of top-down control and, you know, future releases push it in certain directions. And so I was wondering if you could talk about it, that same kind of technological control and legitimacy issue, but maybe more from the perspective of the software, you know, companies rather than the users. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. I would love to take that up, Mike, if you're comfortable with that. Yeah, I spent a good amount of time in the book talking, just like actually analyzing marketing materials and instructional videos that are made by the manufacturers. I mean, and also like reporting on conversations that I've had with the teams. But yeah, they have ideas about how the tools should be used or how they hope that they will be used. But you know, some of that just falls by the wayside when they're just trying to be a successful company. Autotune really never had that problem because it was so successful so fast. But there were a different set of problems that they had. For example, Hildebrand, the inventor, you know, really actually didn't like this misuse of the tool at the 0 setting where you can hear the effect. And that I think has everything to do with race, because he like, there's this NAMM oral history interview in which he like describes that use, and he says he like dismisses it, and he's saying, oh, that's what the rappers use, but I like the Cher song. So, you know, that's not veiled, it's barely veiled, I think. And he was like, well, I just kind of included that setting for kicks, I never assumed anyone would use it. Now he's come around, it's been like, you know, he's had a long time to get used to it, and he, I think, can acknowledge that that function of the product has made it even wildly more successful than it would have been otherwise, but it wasn't in his mind when he created it. So he sort of like begrudgingly just accepted that it became a tool that's used by hip hop artists. And, you know, he's like a classically trained flautist and would rather have had a different, you know, it be famous for a different reason. And then similarly, the Melodyne crew, you know, they give all sorts of instruction especially in the like instructional manuals that you get when you buy the product. They really try to teach you a sensibility of how to use the thing with like all these like musical qualities in mind, you know, like be a real musician, you really have to listen to it, and here's what music is, and we hope that you'll use it in this way. And the language is really, really strong. I think like just generally as a research tool, looking at the things that come to accompany a tool are really useful in identifying what the manufacturer hopes you'll use it for. And, you know, while pitch correction wasn't on the mind of like the Melodyne team at the start, they have acknowledged that, again, you know, like the alternative dream of experimental composition that Melodyne started as that dream is kind of kept alive and kept afloat by the fact that so many people buy it for pitch correction, because you can still do all the other stuff. You can still use it, not as a pitch correction tool, just not that many people do that. But for the inventor, the fact that, like he gets to keep developing and working on this product, and that like it's possible that some people might use it for this experimental stuff, like that still exists because his company is still in business. So it's really, it's totally fascinating, and I think probably different for every product. But you can really see, you can like read into the sensibilities that the manufacturers are trying to teach based on the materials that they create to instruct you on how to use the tool, I think.
Yeah, I feel like just to respond to Brian's second part of Brian's question, which I think relates to Mark's question about insider outsider, kind of, these dichotomies between companies and users and between companies and scholars and all this. But I feel like we're in the space now, which again just highlights, following James, like how kind of neoliberal the music products industry is that the whole narrative of misuse of technology, like the idea that the software comes out or the hardware comes out and then people misuse it. I feel like nowadays that's fallen apart so much because so many people, so many musicians work for companies as product specialists. And so they're telling the companies what they want designed into them based on their own creative practices. And there's such a kind of give and take between designers and users nowadays that it's hard to find moments where it's like how people are actually resisting the way that software is meant to function. I feel like that's a lot harder to find nowadays because you have scholars and you have musicians who work for the companies in various capacities, either as consultants or product specialists or brand managers or whatever the case may be.
You got a lot of cherry picking of the questions going on here. No, it's cool. Kira, you've been somewhat talked to, but I would still love to hear you come in. You out there, Kira?
I am.
Okay, great.
First of all, both were great. I'm looking forward to the books. Catherine, if you put yours in the link, I'll buy that one too.
Mine doesn't exist yet as a link, but I can't wait until it does.
No, I don't have any additional. I'm enjoying the conversation. I put some other conversations. Mike, if you could re-presence the person, Aaron, that you mentioned, Aaron Barris.
Oh yeah, Aaron Barra, ERINBARRA. She was at Berklee College of Music for a while, teaching part of the songwriting and music production program, and then she took a gig at Arizona State University as the director of popular music over there. But she started the nonprofit Beats by Girls, which is they have chapters all over the world about teaching young women how to like engineer and make beats, make music.
You mentioned a study. That's what I was by.
Oh,
Aaron.
sorry. Oh, yeah. So the specific name of that study, research. Let me find that.
I'll tell you what, while you're looking for that, maybe
I'll look for it.
Should I go ahead and bring another question in?
Yeah, I think that works. Yeah, I'll find that study for you.
Okay, sounds good. Thomas Miller.
Hi, thanks for two great talks. Before I ask my question, I just want to say, Mike, a moment ago, you said Apidal for Apple, I think, and I guess it was a slip, but it's very productive. And I think we need that concept of apidalism to describe a lot of things. So my actual question is, it's rooted in an anecdote, and I guess it's for Catherine, but also maybe for Mike. Back in 1999, I happened to be doing ethnographic fieldwork in a remote area of Siberia. And I was in a room full of people and they're listening to the international pop hits of that year. And Cher comes on singing Believe, and the room just went silent. And the older adults said, what's wrong with her voice? And the kid said, how does she get that sound with her voice? And then the one younger adult in the room just kind of shook his head very gravely and said, computer. Everybody went, yes, of course. And then I found myself trying to explain who Sonny and Cher were to people who grew up in the Soviet Union, and that was impossible. But I was, at that time, just saying it's the computer sort of was the only explanation that was needed. And so I'm wondering, by now, how much do you think Autotune has really been an agent of globalization and furthered it? And also, to what extent is it now normalized around the world?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and a dream of kind of like future bigger project. But I think I'll just try to answer it somewhat briefly. Jace Clayton talks about this some in his book Uproot, because he's done some work in North Africa and with musicians there, and talks about the uses of Autotune in that space. And I think doesn't exactly make the argument that it's like used exactly how it is in US pop spaces, but it has its own character. But nonetheless, it's a tool that has traveled globally. Like everybody uses it. And I think really basically in any production space where the expectation is a professional sounding product, Autotune will be on it, almost regardless of genre. And that includes now, if we're just like back in the US, that includes genres that are kind of assumed to be sort of safeguarded from this kind of editing, like classical, like jazz, like folk, like Autotune is everywhere. So I think in that regard, and Melodyne is everywhere too. In that regard, yes, there has been this kind of standardization of a professional aesthetic, like what a professional vocal recording sounds like, where pitch correction is sort of just taken as a given. But the practices do kind of vary place to place. And one of the interesting things about both of the tools is that they do give you options for other scales. So like, the default is that we use it and like based on the Western tonal system, but there are drop-down menus in both where you could pick scales that are like nothing like our system. People use that so little, but it does exist. You can do it. And like one question I have for future work is actually to find spaces in which people use these alternatives, if they use them at all. And why the manufacturers have kind of kept them on for a kind of legitimization, I think, of what the tool might be capable of, even though so few people use them. But the meanings are different across space too. So when you hear Autotune and reggaeton, or if you like think about if you think about other genres, it's not the meaning of hearing that voice or the voice produced in this particular way, I don't think is consistent across spaces. But in terms of practice and like the kind of tool that you might use, it is pretty consistent on any part of the globe, really.
Yeah. I was gonna second Jace's book. Uproot is a really good look at how electronic music is designed in such ways that it sort of perpetuates a sort of like imperialist, like 4/4 120 BPM type mindset, right? And this is the thing, when you're in like gear communities, a lot of people in gear communities try to act like these values don't exist. Like they say, oh, it's not about the tool, it's about how you use it, right? But I think that exactly what Catherine's talking about, like the fact that some software is just encourages more alternative ways of doing things than others, right? Like Bitwig Studio, it's much easier to sort of work with micro tuning systems or things like that. So it's true. I think a big argument is that certain software does sort of perpetuate things more than others, and that these aren't just neutral things, obviously. But I posted a link to that Tom Faber piece, which is also a good piece that looks at how you could, like how we might potentially decolonize music software in the West, at least.
Jody Rosen.
Hello, everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I had a couple of questions for Catherine. I don't know, Eric, should I just choose one of my questions, or how are we doing this?
Probably.
Okay. Well, just first, this conversation is great, so fascinating, so many things to think about. And actually, it strikes me, Catherine was talking about the question of labor and gender, and it's fascinating to think about what you said about women singing on hip hop tracks, like the women who were singing the hook suddenly vanishing from pop. I hadn't thought about that, but that's absolutely true. And it strikes me that the kind of labor equation swings in the other direction also, because if you think, going to the Thomas's question just now about the global use of Autotune, that in something like SoundCloud rap or the global drill movement, you have kids who are don't have a lot of money, sitting at home using this software, and they can create a vocal hook without recourse to a singer. And of course Autotune and those kind of vocal hooks are ubiquitous in those traditions. And you've got obviously drill is big everywhere, and like huge in West Africa right now, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but my question for Catherine was, I guess I'm going to choose this one. Just, I'd love to hear you say more about, you mentioned that there are these discourses about the real that circulate among those who aren't, anti-auto-tune. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about what those arguments are.
Yeah, cool. I would love that. I would love to, yeah. And I'll just say, just to follow off your comment, I think one of the points I'd like to make, or kind of leave this conversation having made, is that there is what I see, one of the big things that pitch correction changes and intervenes on, I think, is like really kind of devaluing what has traditionally been female labor in pop spaces that relates to, women have been confined to singing as like their means of participation in pop for so long. And there's a way that pitch correction actually kind of just like short circuits the whole thing. And like you said, makes it so that, like teenagers who are hanging out in their rooms can just actually sing a track and for it to sound good enough that they don't need a singer. So I'm trying to kind of elaborate that more and like think about these politics of gendered labor in musical spaces in which singing, plays such a big part. As for the conversations about the real, what I'm trying to say is that, like, yes, there's this one particular conversation about authenticity that's like, was that voice modified or not? Can we like trust what it is? Is that her real voice? And often it is her real voice. It's like there aren't as many like outing videos on YouTube for male singers. It's usually female singers that are kind of like outed in their ability or non-ability, but like whether they're authentic. But I'm like thinking about the genres, for example, of like emo rap or even hyper pop, where there's kind of this like exaggerated denaturalization of the voice. And the point is not that that old model of authenticity be recreated, but what I'm saying is that those genres still have their own logics of realness and what a voice, the value of the voice within it. And I think like the tech part, or like sounding like the technology or sounding with the technology, offers that realness a lot of the time, and like offers that value. So the way, like I'm trying to think of a good example here, like 100 Jacks or something. 100 Jacks, their voices are not meant to sound anything like them, but they sound like the tools that they can use, and they sound like the technological labor, and that has its own kind of politics of like realness and musicality. And so yeah, I'm just trying to say that it doesn't like stop with that conversation about like transparency, that it actually is more complex than that.
I love it. Hyper pop rockism. Excellent.
Yeah.
We haven't just gone full circle. We've spun ourselves into a daze. I think final question for today, Mark Katz.
Oh, well, Mike sort of addressed it, but if you want to address it more, I was just curious about navigating your insiderness and outsiderness. It's, as you say, it kind of collapses, but it's also real in the sense that you want to have a certain, scholarly integrity. And how is that? How do you even define that when you're kind of, moving through these different spaces?
Yeah, so the big thing I didn't want to do was just, and this is for any of us who work on popular commercial music, right, is that we don't want to just be mouthpieces for the artists or the tools or whatever it is that we're talking about. And that was a big kind of push for the book, is to avoid just being like a marketing mouthpiece for the software. So I had to navigate, I am connected professionally with a lot of these companies, both the Ableton, I have to connect with my brand manager to get discounts on the software for my students, and to kind of navigate like the licenses so that we can use the software in our school. I have to be like friendly with Avid, because I am a certified trainer within their company. And so it's hard. That's been the other part of it, is to kind of like balance the critical side, which wanting to be extremely critical, but then also wanting to sort of address like what I see as the positive potential that a lot of the people working for these companies invest in the company, right? So and that's what I see design as, the real intermediary between those two things, because design is this process that balances manufacturing and use, and that's kind of where I saw myself in the whole process, as a sort of designer that has to balance these things, because I'm an intermediary between my students who are using the software and the company and what they want me to convey to my students and things like that. So I do think the short answer to the question is that the blurred lines between insider and outsider it does get very blurry. And I don't really see, maybe I don't see the dichotomy as so helpful at the end, in the end.
Thanks. And just, I'm very excited about both these books. So thank you both.
I will echo that thanks on behalf of everybody. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Catherine. I'm just going to hit pause.